Welcome to the Bill Seng Podcast. My name is Bill Seng. I got a very special episode for you tonight. We are going to be talking about how to convince people that God exists. This was actually a question that came up the other day at church. We were doing our Sunday morning lesson, and we get all sorts of questions. We're actually studying through the Screw Tape Letters, of all things, and all sorts of side topics pop up. And this was actually in relation to the topic we were going over, is how do you convince people that God exists? And before getting into this, what I do want you to know is that this is something that I have written about. I have been into apologetics now for, my goodness, I think it's getting close. It's been at least 15 years, and I would say about 15 years or so I've been into apologetics. And I've written some books on this topic as well. My very first book was called The World That Then Was. That one was a very creationist specific book. But the one that I'm going to be focusing on more tonight is 10 Irrefutable Proofs of Creation. 10 Irrefutable Proofs of Creation. Smaller book, easier book to understand in my opinion. And it gives more of a general idea about how to know that God exists. And I do believe that this point is in there. If it is not, I apologize, but I believe that it is actually inside of 10 Irrefutable Proofs of Creation. And I believe it is probably the most compelling, most convincing point regarding how to know that God exists. And it only works if you allow your mind to go there, but also if you are a Christian and you want to prove to somebody that God exists, the first thing I want to tell you is you're not going to be able to do it. You are not going to be able to prove to anybody that God exists. Only God can open up people's eyes to reveal to them that He exists. So if you give somebody an explanation like I'm about to give tonight, don't feel discouraged if the person you're talking to is not convinced afterwards. If they are still belligerent, if they are still rude, if they are still offish with you, you could give the most perfect argument in all of history with all the facts and all the details about how it is that you know that God exists, and they might still totally reject the argument. Having said this, I have found this argument to be very compelling, and it has worked very well when I talk to people regarding the existence of God. But of course, the first thing is that they have to have a heart that's willing to receive it. And this is just one proof that God exists. But once again, I will say that I believe it to be the strongest proof. And it's got steps, it's got elements, it's got components to this argument. So I want you to follow me closely as I go along here, because the first part is just breaking the ice here. And these are just theological terms that I think that if you're a Christian, you need to be aware of. There are two types of revelation. Remember what I just said. The only person that can convince somebody of anything in relation to the existence of God is God Himself. He's got to open up your eyes. He's got to soften your heart. You've got to be willing to accept God. And revelation is a word that means to unveil, to make known. So there's two types of revelation that exist in this world. The first one is called general revelation. And we got on this topic the other day because I had read something not too long ago, a compelling argument regarding the existence of God. Okay, I emphasize that for a reason, and I will tell you why I emphasize that in a minute. What I mean is that in this example, it was mentioned that when I look at the sunrise, I can tell you that God exists. When I see the smile on a little boy's face, I can tell you that God exists. And so, generally, once again, general revelation, you can see things in nature. You can see things in reality that tell you that God exists. Then there is special revelation. General revelation doesn't tell you anything about who God is, or what God expects of us, or you will not arrive to an understanding of Jesus Christ through general revelation. That takes us to special revelation. Special revelation is a specific revealing of God by himself. And so forms of special revelation would include the Bible, would include the prophets of ancient times, and it would include Jesus Christ himself, special revelation. And if you happen to have if an angel or God himself were to come to you and reveal himself, that would be a special form of revelation. Well, that would be special revelation. So it's God directly revealing himself to you. By the way, I caution everybody on the idea of receiving testimony from angels. I think that's a very it's not a good idea to do it. I do believe that angels can deliver messages, but it's not always a good idea to receive the messages from angels. Man, I sound crazy right now, but that's just a theological caution right there. But again, special revelation is a special revelation, a specific revelation that's given to people by God himself. Now, most of this argument I'm making, this argument I'm making in this video is mostly regarding general revelation. So how can we know that God exists? Not necessarily who God is, but how can we know that God exists to everybody? That anybody could come to the conclusion that God exists. And I'm not going to get into science or anything like that. This is going to be a little bit more philosophy behind science, reasoning behind science, reasoning behind natural observations right here. And the first thing I'm going to point out is that everybody, no matter who you are, no matter whether you know it or you don't, believes that something supernatural either exists or happened at some point in time. What do I mean by that? Well, clearly, if you already believe in God, you believe that God is the supernatural creator of all things. He's beyond his creation, that there is no way to measure God or to grasp God physically, that God is transcendent. He's beyond his creation, and he's beyond our ability to fully understand him with our material faculties. For those of you that don't believe in God, you believe in something supernatural too. Now I'm going to point out, first of all, that there is a problem with this because, what I used to always say, and I'm still going to use it for these purposes because the scientific community is still trying to hold on to this. You believe in the Big Bang. If you don't believe in the Big Bang, you believe that something is eternal and that something supernatural had to have happened for everything to come into existence. And the reason being is that we have these things called the laws of physics. A law is something observed in nature that has no contradictory cases to it, meaning we've never observed anything other than this. And the law of conservation of matter, for one, is a problem when it comes to the coming into existence of the universe. And so we must conclude the universe itself must be eternal in some way or another, whether that be in this crazy never-ending cycle, but at some point it had just an eternal existence outside of the time that we perceive, because you can't always have an event before all events. You can't say that, well, the Big Bang happened, and then there's this collision of particles, and then before the matter and antimatter, and there's something before that, and there's something before that, and there's something before that. You can't go on eternally like that. Somewhere, something started it all, started the whole process. Something had an eternal existence that started everything. So what does that mean? We can't duplicate that. We cannot scientifically in a laboratory replicate what it was that started everything. Not even the Big Bang. We haven't been able to duplicate the Big Bang even. And so what you come down to is that there is one of two possibilities for where everything came from. one of two possibilities of what it is that could be eternal. Either a supreme intelligence, such as God, or this eternal nothingness that we call the universe. God would be a being that thoughtfully and intentionally created everything and brought order to everything, and the universe would just be a force of chaos, an eternal force of chaos with no thought, with no rhyme, with no reason, with no intention. And when you put it in that perspective, how can the universe possibly create anything? There's got to be something existing in order for the universe to be able to manipulate it. With God, we know that he is beyond creation. Therefore, the laws of physics do not apply to him because he is the creator of the laws of physics within the universe. Where did all the laws come from? Where do all the rules come from? Where is it that we see this order come out of within the universe if it's thoughtless and it has no intent? Now with me, when I think of the two possibilities, just from a purely reasonable, logical, rational perspective, I believe in God, just making that clear. But if I were to not believe in God, if I believe the universe to be eternal, I could see the possibility, reasonably speaking, of maybe rocks and planets and explosions coming out of the eternal chaos of the universe. Maybe. If matter is even able to form in that regard, under those conditions. Now, what I cannot get my head around is how life would emerge, because something would have to animate things. You see, the universe would be inanimate for eternity, and for things to come into existence, something would have to change within that eternal framework, within that eternal structure. And for life to emerge, well, we got something totally different now. No longer are things thoughtless and inanimate, but now things are thoughtful and animate. And this thing inside of our heads called the human brain is the most incredible, sophisticated device that emerged out of nature within the entire universe. How does something like that come into existence randomly? Lawrence Krauss, big-time atheist. One, I would say, probably top 5 atheists in terms of his intellect, his conviction, and his ability to reason inside of the world today. He's probably within the top 5 of top atheists. And Lawrence Krauss, inside of a debate, when he was asked about what the odds of life emerging randomly through evolutionary processes was, he said, well, it's essentially zero. And he was being very frank. He was being very honest. He knew that was a weak point inside of his argument. But his defense for that, well, if you give it billions of years over time, life will eventually emerge. Well, I contest you could, without some sort of divine spark, you could go millions and bajillions of years and never have the components to perfectly bring forth life. The millions and billions of years is merely a way to be able to say that, well, yeah, if odds are essentially zero, they're just not going to happen. Even it's 0.0 to the 1 billionth power and then 1, you can give it all the time in eternity, and it just won't happen. So, likelihood of life emerging without some sort of divine essence is basically zero. You believe in something supernatural. Is it a supreme intelligence? Or is it an eternal, thoughtless, mindless chaos? I want you to think about that. I'm going to talk about this again eventually because general revelation can only take you so far. It can only tell you that there is a God. It cannot tell you who God is. It cannot tell you what he is like. And you would definitely not come to the conclusion that he had a son named Jesus. Also, Nature, general revelation, cannot tell you about morality. And we have to come to grips with that. It's just true. It would never tell us anything about morality just to look at the sunrise. We can say it's cool. We can say there's a God that loves us because we feel that inside of our hearts, and there's something to be said about that, but you would never come to any specifics, and therefore you don't know if you're resting in God's grace and His love, or if you're an object of God's wrath. And it's important to understand which one of those that you are, and there is a solution to those of you who are not in the grace and favor of God, that being His Son, Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is the supreme, the ultimate form of special revelation that we've ever had, because He was God, is God in the flesh, and He came to make Himself known to us and to die for our sins. Thank you for joining me for tonight's episode of the Bill Saying Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.